The prophecy, I better move this down, a little short. The prophecy that Habakkuk the prophet received. Habakkuk's complaint. O Lord, let's start that over. How long, Lord, must I call for help, but you do not listen? Or cry out to you, violence, but you do not save? Why do you make me look at injustice? Why do you tolerate wrongdoing? Destruction and violence are before me. There is strife and conflict abounds. Therefore, the law is paralyzed and justice never prevails. The wicked hem in the righteous so that justice is perverted. The Lord's answer. Look at the nations and watch and be utterly amazed. For I am going to do something in your days that you would not believe even if you were told. I am raising up the Babylonians, that ruthless and impetuous people who sweep across the whole earth to seize dwellings not their own. They are a feared and dreaded people. They are a law to themselves and promote their own honor. Their horses are swifter than leopards, fiercer than wolves at dusk. Their cavalry gallops headlong. Their horsemen come from afar. They fly like an eagle swooping to devour. They all come intent on violence. Their hordes advance like a desert wind and gather prisoners like sand. They mock kings and scoff at rulers. They laugh at all fortified cities. By building earthen ramps, they capture them. Then they sweep past like the wind and go on. Guilty people whose own strength is their God.
Good morning. As Jeff mentioned earlier, my name's Will, and I'm just really grateful for this chance to speak with you today. I never really understood why people at award shows always will say that they're so humbled to receive an award. I always thought, like, you're getting recognition, shouldn't you be less humble than you were 5 minutes ago? But in the last, 3 weeks as I've been preparing for today, I feel like I actually learned what that phrase meant, not because I'm getting an award, but because when a significant event comes up, oftentimes the insecurities that you have come up, and just been battling with these feelings of inadequacy and insecurity as I've prepared. And so I feel like I've taught myself what it means to be humbled by something. A moment that is particularly burned into my memory from growing up in church is when I got to hear Luis Palau, the famous televangelist, speak at my home church when I was in high school. And of course, this is one of the most prominent, well-renowned faces of 20th century Christianity. And of course, I only remember one tiny thing that he said, and it has nothing to do with anything significant for theology or faith. It was his own experience speaking for the first time on a Sunday at church. And again, this is maybe the best speaker I've ever heard in my life. And he said that he practiced as anyone does, and the first time he did it, he got up on a Sunday, rambled through the entire thing very quickly, and totally botched it. And so I share that as just a preeminent request for grace as I try to do the same. Will you pray with me? God, we come before you today with humble hearts. Every time we open your word, it's appropriate we ask for your help. We just ask that the words of our mouths and the meditations of our heart would be pleasing to you today and every day. In your name, amen. At this time, I'll invite you to turn to Habakkuk chapter 1, page 762 in your pew Bibles, as Nancy read. And as you do, I just want to say I'm grateful to have gotten this passage for a few reasons. The first one being that it rescues us from our seemingly endless Sermon on the Mount series that's been going on longer than I can remember. So it gives us some new material. And it also, I appreciate going first and getting to introduce because it gives Jeff now 3 or 4 weeks to correct and audit anything that's out of bounds that comes out in the next 20 minutes from me. Read with me again from chapter 1. How long, Lord, must I call for help, but you do not listen? Or cry out to you violence, but you do not save? Why do you make me look at injustice? Why do you tolerate wrongdoing? Destruction and violence are before me. There is strife and conflict abounds. Therefore, the law is paralyzed, justice never prevails. The wicked hem in the righteous, so that justice is perverted. Habakkuk resides in a dangerous, confusing world at a particularly bad time. The southern kingdom of Judah, where he prophesies, is stuck in another period of disobedience, unsurprisingly, while the powerful nations around them, Assyria and Babylon, are fighting for power and control. Habakkuk sees this moral decay in his own nation and political military threat from those around him. The Assyrians, who have controlled the Middle East for decades and centuries, are finally on the decline, and just as quickly the Babylonians are rising up, and they look just as ominous. And you can hear Habakkuk almost asking, like, give me a break here. I mean, we cannot catch a break with these oppressive nations controlling Israel. The name Habakkuk means to wrestle. I think it's fitting as he has to reconcile and come to terms with his own role in this dangerous world. He observes the chaos and asks questions that we ask all the time. Where is God in this? Why am I the one to live through these evil times? And then, of course, how do I reconcile this changing landscape with the goodness of God? Now, it doesn't take a political expert to relate Habakkuk's observations and his world to ours today. He questions God's purposes and the justification of why these things are happening. Even just reading it once over, I'm sure you can think of ways that his words reflect the world that we see. Violence, injustice, strife, conflict, wrongdoing are all named. These things have not gone away. We ask similar questions almost on a daily basis. How does violence in the U.S. relate to God's plan? How about the rise and fall of political movements, violence in Russia, earthquakes in Turkey and Syria? How does God allow these things to persist, given his promises to us? Habakkuk reminds me of Frodo here from Lord of the Rings. Frodo resides in a terrible time for Middle-earth, maybe the worst ever. Though he comes from a people, the hobbits, who are always known for being peaceful, living in community. And Frodo's upset. He holds this powerful ring for reasons unbeknownst to him. And the evil one, Sauron, is on the move and pursuing him specifically. And Frodo's upset. He's like, why me? How my ancestors have lived for as long as, recorded history in peace. And so Frodo says to Gandalf, who's the wise wizard, he says, I wish it need not have happened in my time. To which Gandalf replies, so do all who live to see such times. But that is not for them to decide. All we have to decide is what to do with the time given to us. I could see him saying the exact same thing to Habakkuk. I certainly felt this way during COVID, as I'm sure many of you did. After starting my freshman year of college, just amazingly and having so much fun. Spring break totally got shut down. Had to go home, and then my sophomore year was basically stripped of everything fun with college besides going to class. And I know there's people in here who lost loved ones, lost much more than a semester of college. And it's just human nature to ask, why me? Why now? Why this particular place and time? This kind of frustration transcends time periods, and it pulls us right into Habakkuk's story. As we move towards God's answer, then, I want to mention a quote I heard from Fleming Rutledge, the Anglican priest, in a class with Dr. Lauber, who's in here somewhere, a few weeks ago, regarding not Habakkuk, but another suffering conversation partner with God in the Old Testament, Job. When him and his friends have finally worn themselves out, complaining and counter-arguing about God for 37 chapters, God finally answers in chapter 38. And he says to Job, brace yourself like a man. I will question you, and you shall answer me. In her analysis, Rutledge explains the following, that this is the unique voice of God reinvesting the suffering Job with dignity equal to that of God himself. Hear it again, brace yourself like a man. I will question you, and you shall answer me. She continues, Job is called to meet with God man to man. Such is the meaning of being made in the image of God. What makes her interpretation impactful, at least to me, is the fact that God knows Job doesn't have any answers here. But he chooses to welcome Job into conversation regardless of that fact. It's not as if God's been waiting for Job to wear himself out and says, okay, now I'll give you the answers. He's been listening. And now when you look closer, he's actually saying, Job, talk to me. He says, dialogue with me. That willingness to dialogue and the willingness to bring Job up to God's level of conversation is the dignity, as Rutledge says, of being made in God's image. It's the dignity that we hold, and it's the dignity that Habakkuk holds. This isn't, of course, to say that God responds in the same way to Job and Habakkuk. Their stories are different. But the similarities, I think, allow us to be surprised by what we see with God's response. Having read Job, you might expect God's response here to be long and indicting, critical of Habakkuk. But it's not. It's 6 verses. It's concise. Look at verse 5. God doesn't put Habakkuk in his place or remind him of his humanity. He just starts answering. And I think his lack of critique here is astounding, really. Habakkuk has just made some huge accusations of God. First character, his lack of power. And yet God chooses not to critique, but to affirm the validity of his questions by saying, as if to say, you don't have the answers, but it's a good question. Or, I see where you're coming from. I think it should give us confidence in many ways that Scripture allows for people like Habakkuk to ask questions that prompt this kind of response from the Almighty. He's willing to take us seriously, even when he could certainly humiliate us. He chooses not to humiliate Habakkuk. Isn't this true of parents in the room? I'm sure it's true of my parents who are listening online, I'm sure. But kids, I'm sure, ask you silly questions all the time. Questions that are either misguided or aren't the right questions, and yet you choose to answer them in a way that they can understand. Think of a kid asking his dad how a car goes. Of course, the answer, which I don't know super well, is that it's a series of explosions in the engine that power certain things and turn the crankshaft to make the car move. But yet, that answer is totally useless to a kid. Although it's totally true, it's completely useless. And so instead, we say the driver hits the gas pedal or the engine makes the car go. That answer is also true. It's just as true as the first one, although it's less nuanced and less all-encompassing. I think the same is true of God's answers to us oftentimes, is that they don't necessarily reflect the full extent of God's mechanisms and purposes, not because he couldn't explain them if he wanted to, but because we wouldn't understand them. I think it's an act of generosity and humility in any case to answer a question of our kids. But it's our love for them that prompts us to explain things in ways that they can understand. The same is true for the creator of the whole universe. I wonder how often we take for granted that the fact that our God is willing to communicate with us on our terms in ways that we can understand in any capacity. I think that keeping this distinction between humans and God illumines in many ways the profoundness of his answer. It's for this reason I think the first chapter of Habakkuk, although riddled with heartache and despair, is actually relatively encouraging. It validates the human experience, gives us license to be upset without fearing how God will react with us, gives us license to be frustrated, ask big questions. If the prophets of Scripture who got to speak with God one-on-one had these kind of concerns, then I think it's certainly fair for us to have the same ones. And so while it's normal and reasonable to feel this way from time to time, it doesn't mean we're always right. It doesn't mean Habakkuk's fully right. Verse 4, Habakkuk says, the law is powerless. Justice never goes forth. Well, we know why Habakkuk's feeling this way, and we can acknowledge where he's coming from. It doesn't mean he's right. It doesn't mean he's justified in all of his claims. God's law is not powerless. God is a God of justice, even when it doesn't look like it at a particular time. And I think God's response, generous as it is, it doesn't let this misunderstanding slide. He doesn't let it go. By focusing on his own actions and saying, look at what I'm doing, God pivots Habakkuk, puts him back on his feet, and directs him towards what he's already begun, reminds him of his promises, which are true. And though Habakkuk certainly couldn't have expected Babylon to be God's tool of choice for bringing about his divine plan for justice, it's what it is. And I think that surprise is a testament to this distinction which I talked about earlier between God and us. Does anybody know how we discovered the planet Neptune? I wonder if anybody does. In a testament to Wheaton College's liberal arts, I was forced to take a science class against my will. And I actually learned something worth sharing today, I think. And it's that the discovery of Neptune was actually a total accident. It was a funny scientific accident. That we had discovered most of the planets in the solar system, but a lot of the orbits and the way that they were interacting with each other didn't line up perfectly. And so they concluded there must be some other force in the solar system affecting them in the way that it was. And they could pinpoint the size and the location of this force, but they didn't know what it was. And so they called this mysterious thing Neptune, pointed a telescope where they thought it would be, and then, of course, found the planet Neptune. And I think this is often how we think, usually because it works. We think cause and effect, logic. That's the way our natural world often functions. But I think problems show up when we think about God in this way. This is what Habakkuk does. He looks at the world around him, which is crumbling, and he says, the world is bad, the law must be powerless, justice must not be winning. Isn't that relatable? I think we do that all the time. The questions I brought up earlier and 100 others. We ask, I thought God had plans to prosper me, to prosper the church, as he did with Joshua. Why is life so hard? Why is nothing working? And so while his thoughts, they sound logical and they sound like they make sense, it just doesn't align with the bigger picture. Habakkuk, like us, he can't zoom out and see the world how God sees it. His time frame is too short, vision too nearsighted to envision God's plan. I think this is why God often, as with Habakkuk, has to redirect us and point us towards the question we should be asking rather than answering the one that we do. As you may have noticed, God doesn't give Habakkuk any kind of a direct answer. Habakkuk says, God, I have all these concerns and questions about who you are and what you're doing. And God just says, look. It's all action. He says, look at what I'm going to do. It's not an answer at all to Habakkuk's question. It's God's answer, but it's not a direct answer. Think of Moses here in Exodus 3. When he does the same thing, Moses is feeling insecure, and he asks, who am I that I should go to Pharaoh to bring the Israelites out of Egypt? This is a fair question. It's a big job. And God responds, I will be with you, and you will worship me on Mount Sinai. It's not a direct answer at all. Jesus does the same thing when people ask him questions and then he speaks in parables. And they're so convoluted that the disciples have to come to him at night and say, Jesus, what does this mean? And if the disciples didn't get it, I'm sure the general crowds didn't get it either. And you think, why? It's I thought Jesus had all the answers. Why isn't he answering questions directly? Shouldn't he have the power to do that? And I think he does, but just like Habakkuk, it's that God doesn't always answer the questions we ask. Oftentimes, not because he doesn't have the answer, but I think because his answer points us towards the question that we should be asking rather than the ones that we do. I think God's response here tells Habakkuk that he should be asking, how are you going to uphold your promises? He should be saying, I know your promises are true. How are you going to do it? See his answer? It says, look. And he's saying, Habakkuk, tell me how I'm going to do it. Ask me what I'm going to do, rather than questioning who I am or my promises. It's a total pivot, and I think it's designed and intended to put Habakkuk back on his feet, help him look how he should be looking at the world, and to acknowledge that he doesn't have the foresight that God does. So anyway, what is it about Habakkuk's plea that, although he may be asking misguided questions, elicits a generous response from God, at least more generous than we see in Job and elsewhere in the Old Testament? What does Habakkuk do to garner this kind of treatment? I have a few ideas, short list, so I invite you to think with me. The first one I think most obvious is just that Habakkuk is super honest with God and with his feelings. He's real and raw, unafraid to show God his true colors in this moment. I think it's indicative of probably his entire prayer life, of just like true emotional realism, being realistic with God in a way that oftentimes I think we don't. I think the second one is that he has a valid reason to complain, right? Like, he's not complaining about trivial things here. His world is crumbling. There's moral decay among his people, and there seems to be this imminent threat of destruction from elsewhere. Of course, this is a subjective judgment of what we gauge as like a viable thing to bring before God. But I think it's important to point out that God doesn't criticize Habakkuk's verbalization at all. And I think he actually welcomes it. It's human nature to verbalize with each other when we go through hard things. I think the same is true with God, with the relational God who wants to know us. I think the verbalization is totally safe here. There's no critique of that at all. I think he has real reason to complain. God isn't afraid to hear our complaints. And the third I could come up with was I think it's in what Habakkuk doesn't say. And although he's really frustrated and upset, you can still see him holding his tongue a bit. And there's there's places he just won't go. As frustrated as he gets, he doesn't consider abandoning God. He doesn't say, I could never believe in a God like this, or how could you possibly be like this? And he's able to enter into this deep emotional doubt without being in danger of losing his faith, without questioning his deepest convictions. And I think this holding of his tongue is what makes him a model for faithful doubt, is that although he's so stricken, there's some places he just won't go. And he shows some self-control. So I just wonder what it would look like if we could better model Habakkuk and learn a bit from his conversation with God, at least what he does right. Could we be more real and honest about our own life context, circumstances? Could we learn to stand strong in our faith commitments as we work through deep questions of doubt and fear? Reminding each other that our God is the one who wants to hear from us, wants to hear how we feel from us. Habakkuk has huge doubts and questions, probably as big as anyone in this room. And he ended up in the Bible, after all. I think his inclusion in the canon in many ways is an invitation to Habakkuk to wrestle with the questions that we have. It's okay. It's in bounds. It's stayed in the Bible this whole time. I think it's just an invitation to do what he does. I want to close with an image from Richard Hayes, another Dr. Lauber class reference, the New Testament scholar, in Revelation 19, where we have this glorious warrior rider entering battle. His name is Faithful and True, and his robe is dipped in blood beforehand as he enters battle. The armies of heaven follow behind him, dressed in fine linen, white and clean. The rider, of course, is Christ, entering into this cosmic battle of good and evil in the end times. And the twist is that while we'd expect this warrior, this like grand victor, to be covered in the blood of his enemies, as David and Saul would, Christ's blood is not of his enemies, it's his own blood, shed for us in advance, before the battle's even begun. You think, what is going on? I think it's this turn of phrase that sums up the nature of God in many ways. He's paradoxical and surprising all the time, from the nature of the origin of the blood on his war garments to the fact that he wants to dialogue with us, that he wants to talk to us, even when we're upset, angry with him. The same God who fights for us and sacrifices for us on a daily basis, he wants to assign us the dignity of who we are, made in his image. The same God who knows all the answers, knows our futures totally. He wants to dwell with us as we figure it out. And as we get closer to the answer that he knows, he wants to sit with us. It's surprising, at least to me. He wants to hear from you. I just invite you to speak up and let him in. Will you pray with me? God, we thank you for your word, for the chance to come together and worship. We just pray that you bless the rest of our time together. And we just thank you again for this day. Amen.